Jason Zimmerman is the visual effects supervisor for Star Trek Picard on CBS All Access, in addition to the work he's done on Star Trek Discovery and Star Trek Short Treks. Was Picard a very different creative experience, or did it feel kind of like an extension of the work you've been doing on the Star Trek series?
I think it definitely was different. I mean, obviously the storylines are much more different. Discovery is maybe a little bit more action than Picard. Picard was definitely a lot more story and drama. And for us, excuse me, in visual effects, we definitely had a different sort of experience in terms of the types of things that we were doing. There were a lot more, set extensions and sort of developing the world and the planets and everything. And, also being a season one, there's always a little bit of a learning curve and sort of reestablishing how things look. So a lot of establishing the look of the world, the look of Picard, and how sort of, just the basic shots were set up.
And had you been a fan of the Star Trek universe before you kind of, became involved in these series?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think I like pretty much everybody else had, Star Trek throughout my, growing up. As a kid and also into my teen years and everything, and certainly when I got into visual effects, Star Trek was one of the premier TV and film experiences to push visual effects forward. So, I was definitely a fan, just casually knowing it growing up. And then also as a visual effects supervisor, being able to participate in a Star Trek show was great for me.
As you mentioned, Star Trek has a strong visual effects legacy, multiple Emmys for, across the different shows. Of course, you were nominated for Discovery. How much visual inspiration have you been able to take from, especially The Next Generation, which Picard sort of takes up 20 years after?
Sure. I mean, we look at all the shows for sure and use those as sort of a springboard for what we're doing. I mean, the good thing about Star Trek is there's such an incredible wealth of, information in previous iterations of, ships and characters and everything. So, fortunately for me, I'm not starting from scratch. I have an incredible amount of information to draw from. So there's definitely that. I think that you start with doing your research in the Star Trek universe because you have so many different, visual effects that came before. Like you said, I mean, the Star Trek has been nominated for Emmys almost every year that it's been, been out there. So for us, we definitely took that as sort of a challenge to try and, match and hopefully sort of one up as best we can.
In addition to the shows having sort of different tones, another major difference between Picard and Discovery is that they take place at very different times in sort of the Star Trek mythology. Discovery is a prequel, or at least it started as a prequel, and Picard takes us forward into the future of that technology and that universe. What was it like sort of advancing that sort of future technology beyond where we've seen before?
Well, I mean, one thing, and a good point about Picard is there's definitely less of a Federation presence than there was in the first two seasons of Discovery. Already you're taking sort of a different approach because you're showing different effects than you've probably seen in Discovery. So that was definitely something that we looked at, and also I think from Picard's standpoint, you're talking about one of the most beloved characters in Star Trek ever, and so. His mythology and the world that he came up in is definitely something that we drew inspiration from and tried to do our best to sort of take a look at that, use that as reference, use that as a springboard, and then sort of, any effects that were not previously seen, how could we take what we already knew about the world and the universe and the established looks and then make them our own.
And you're creating a lot of different settings and worlds, and new ships. What's it like working with like the art department on sort of creating those building the world around these characters?
Sure. I mean, the good thing for us is that Todd Chernovsky, the production designer for season one, is somebody that I worked with on Discovery. He has an incredible knowledge of visual effects. And so for us, whenever he designs things, he definitely keeps us in mind. He knows how our department works and how visual effects, work at large. And so it actually makes our job a lot easier because he's already considered a lot of the things that would probably come up before we even get into the process. So that definitely helped us out. And because of that and having, sort of a shorthand with Todd, it was very easy to sort of work and start to create things because he knew exactly what what level the designs had to be at prior to handing them off to us, and how we needed to sort of have a certain amount of information to proceed. And so, the collaboration between, Todd and my department was fantastic, as it always is, because he knew exactly what we needed and when we needed it. And he's very collaborative. And so there was a lot of back and forth and emails and collaboration and conversations always to make sure that, we were going the right direction. And then that goes the other way too, which is, once we take over a model, whether it's the Borg Cube or the La Sirena or whatever, to go back and ask questions and say, what was the intention here? Or do we need to add some more detail here or there or whatever? And so it was really a great experience.
And speaking of the Borg Cube, that's one of the most iconic images and ships of the Star Trek legacy. What was it like bringing that back and sort of reinventing it in a new visual way for this series?
It's daunting. I mean, it's one of the most beloved pieces of Trek canon, and in Trek, so often the ships are really another character in the show and another way to tell the story. And so it's, you're taking something that is, very, very, like I said, beloved, and everybody's going to be paying attention and want it to be a certain way. So, we take the greatest care in building it. We go back and we look at the reference from what they've done in previous iterations of the Borg Cube. Certainly in us designing it in CG, and, it's such a massive, massive thing. I think it's over 2 kilometers, I want to say. On the iteration that we have. So it was really, really big. And so, really taking it in, giving it as much detail as humanly possible, determining the best way to display things like scale. It's a cube, seeing it in space without any sort of like spatial or scale based references, it sometimes can be very difficult to sort of imply how big it really is. And so, looking at it and trying to figure out compositional ways and to place ships and things in the scene to sort of give you a sense of how big this thing really is, was a challenge. But I think it's something as we proceeded through the season, we got better at, and we're really happy with the results of it. But yeah, I mean, it's such a challenge anytime you have that, or, on Discovery when I had the Enterprise, there's the first part of it where you read the script and you go like, oh, it's the Enterprise, or oh, it's the Borg Cube. Okay. And then I got to build it. And you sort of take a very practical approach to the steps that you need to take to do it. And then the first time you see it in the shot, the fan comes out, and I go, oh my God, it's the Borg Cube. How cool is that? And then you kind of nerd out for a little bit, and then you have to get back to business. But it's definitely, how cool to have something that, you grew up on and to be able to play with that and with, the modern tools that we have.
And I also appreciated the subtle details in the effects, like, things like the Starfleet archives and, even just sort of like the interface on Rios' ship, La Sirena, are some of those like smaller, subtle details, just as challenging or even more challenging just to sort of, figure out and get right for the tone of the show and the technology of the show?
For sure. The thing about Star Trek is it's got a very passionate fan base, and everybody's going to look at every frame of what we in visual effects and by extension, every frame of the show in general. And so you have to pay attention to everything down to the most minute detail, because somebody's going to freeze every frame and look at everything to make sure that it all makes sense and that it's part of canon and it represents Star Trek appropriately. So it definitely is something you have to consider in every shot. We look at every frame of everything that we're looking at multiple times to make sure that there's, everything makes sense and that everything is technically correct and accurate. And then just, above and beyond that, I think, as a visual effects guy, sometimes, you do these big, incredible ships and these full CG shots, but there's also something very satisfying about doing the more, invisible effects, if you will, and things that, we touch and we change or we augment or whatever, but no one would know it's a visual effects shot. I think that stuff is sometimes a little bit more satisfying because you've gone in there and you've done something that's helped to tell the story, but no one would know the wiser unless you, showed them behind the scenes.
Now, one of the more fun elements of Rios on the Sirena are his many holograms, and most of the times when we see them, we see them individually. But then, of course, there's one episode where we see them all brought together. What was that like from a visual effects standpoint to kind of play around with those and make that seamless?
I love that effect. I love, doing split screens and things like that. In that particular case, we use motion control for the reveals just to sort of make it a more interesting shot. And, fortunately for me, I'd had experience on previous shows with the show Limitless doing, many multiple passes of different versions of the same character. So I knew it needed to be motion control for, the moving parts of it. And, fortunately, the director, Maya, was very, very, knew what she wanted, I should say. And so we sat down and we collaborated and very quickly figured out what the shots needed to be and how we would set them up. And then it just requires a lot of choreography, especially with the interactive points where one is touching the other or something like that. You sort of have to make sure that everything is in a certain time. Everybody hits their marks exactly. But it's a lot of fun to do those. The motion control is a little bit timely on set, so it does take a little bit more time than your typical like split screen or something, but I think they're really fun shots to shoot.
There's one section of the season set at Free Cloud, which is this very kind of over the top, Las Vegas-y almost kind of place in space. It feels very different from the rest of the show, but of course still integrated with the show. What was it like creating that? And was that kind of just like a visual playground?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, the nice thing when we read the script about that, and we started to get some of the designs from Todd and the production design and art department team, we definitely knew we had a very, very busy and complex environment to create. And once he handed it off to us, fortunately for us, we handed it off to a vendor, and we sort of built the bones of the city and everything, and then we started to say, what sort of other things would sort of enhance the visibility of it. I mean, you use Las Vegas as an example, and I think there's definitely some of that there with all the holograms and, moving signs in the background. And so, we had that opportunity to do that. And it was, again, a little bit something different than I think, you've seen in Trek in the past. And then being able to do the holograms on the La Sirena when they're in orbit over the planet as well, the different holograms that we got to generate, the different advertisements or whatever. That was also really fun to sort of play around with. And it was something that, early on when we prepped it, we discussed with Michael and Akiva sort of what they wanted, and then we put some designs together and put it in front of them. And fortunately, they loved it, and so we got to kind of play around and go to town on the different looks of the Rock'em Sock'em robots and the different the dealers and all that sort of different thing.
Now, it seems like the season finale with that big battle with the Romulan fleet on Soji's homeworld would seem like maybe the most visual effects intensive episode, maybe, or at least the most where they were the most apparent. How much time did it take to work on that, and what went into that relative to the rest of the season?
Not long enough. There's never enough time to do that. That, I think we had about 8 to 10 weeks from start to finish on that. It is definitely a very intensive episode. It actually, episode 214 of Discovery, which you referenced, we got nominated for the Emmy for. I think that episode 214, is actually smaller. The Picard finale might be the largest episode we've done for visual effects, just in terms of shot count and also scope. I mean, there was so much about it that was a little bit different and unique. It wasn't just a space battle. It was a standoff with, giant biomechanical orchids. And so when I read that in the script at first, I kind of smirked and laughed because I knew it was going to be something we would need to kind of collaborate and go back and forth with. And again, we went over the script with Akiva and Michael. We discussed what they thought it might look like. And then the next step was to hand it off to our vendor. And we did. And we said, this is sort of the parameters of what we're talking about. It's a giant orchid that comes in, from the atmosphere and it attacks, and here's what it does. And we have a great, stable of different vendors that work on the show. They're probably the best in the world. And they put in front of us one of the first designs for the orchid that had been based on an art department model. And we just started to tweak from there. And it looked, I would say it was 75% of the way there the first time we saw it, which is a blessing, because then you can spend time on details, you can spend time on movement, and you can really refine all of those things to a point, where you have time to do it. If you don't have the time, then you're not able to maybe, spend as much time on the details. But fortunately for us, we got the design pretty locked down and looking pretty good early on. And so we got to spend a lot of time with each of the shots. And, with sequences like that, it's always a bit challenging because there's a choreography that has to happen. Where do the Romulans arrive? Where does the Federation arrive? Where does the La Sirena come from? Where do the orchids come from? Where are they after they've, been destroyed by the Romulan fleet? And so we start by literally drawing a map, like on a napkin, where the planet is, where we think everybody's going to come. And then we presented that to Akiva, sort of discussed things, did some storyboards, and started to flesh it out. And so we did that. And then fortunately with the storyboards and everything, when we did our previs for it, it came out and it made a lot of sense. I would say probably 75, 80% of our previs ended up being correct geographically, and then it was just about refining animation, refining, you know, movement and everything from there. But yeah, it was definitely a big undertaking, but something fortunately we've been prepared for in previous episodes of Trek with Discovery and everything.
And what's it like watching like sequences like that back again after you've worked so much on them, and you know, you see how the sausage is made, and to see the kind of fantasy of it, you know, completely put together?
Yeah, I think I have a little bit of PTSD. Anytime I work on a sequence like that, I mean, it's just so big, and there's so much. It's so many months of sitting there in a dark room, reviewing shots, giving notes, speaking with vendors. But there's definitely something that's really cool about when you go back and watch it, because I think you kind of lose sight of the story of it all somewhere along the way. Although you do have to honor what the point of the script is, but you get so locked into looking at each individual frame and the technical underpinnings of what you're trying to accomplish. That going back and looking at it as a completed thing, you know, I actually sat down and went through it with my wife, and we watched the entire season, I think, like in 2 days or something like that. And it felt fantastic. And I mean, it's so cool to be working on a show. And, you know, I always tell the story of, you know, whether it's the Borg Cube or the Enterprise or any of those things, there's the technical side of things. So when you get those, you're working on them. That's all you're sort of focusing on. And then when you start to see it for the first time and it's kind of fully realized and photoreal, you kind of stop and go, oh my God, that's the Borg Cube. And you know, by and large, like, oh my God, that's Patrick Stewart. We're working on, that's Jean-Luc Picard. You know, we're working on Picard. So it was very satisfying to kind of go through and go back after a little bit of the dust had settled and the late nights had been sort of erased, and see, you know, how things had turned out.
Well, congratulations on the series. And thank you so much for talking to you today. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.